Good morning, friends. We are continuing with guidelines of conduct for members of the Ananda Sevaka order, which we are expanding to call the Ananda way of life. We are in the section about home life. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to understand how to conduct our lives in such a way that day by day, hour by hour, moment by moment, we transform our consciousness from worldly preoccupations with the details of this world into a divine flow of energy, taking us into thy infinite light. We are one with thy spirit. Awaken us to our deeper truth, our living wisdom. Om. Peace. Amen. And it's very important, especially in a residential community, which is where this comes from, that you have some understanding of what people's, let me say, these guidelines came out of life at Ananda village, which at the present time is 1,000 acres of land up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And it has, I don't know how many individual homes there are there. There's a couple of hundred people who live there. It's been in existence since 1969, 68. Let's see, what do we finally decide on? Its founding year was several years, and so we tinkered with it. When I had to write the book, Light Bearer, which is about Swami Kriyananda and the building of Ananda, the 50th anniversary happened 24 years after the 25th anniversary, because we were sort of celebrating. We hadn't made a firm decision about what the origin date was. Finally, they decided on 1969, I believe, because 2019 was the 50th. But it's been a long time. But if you think about it for a moment, because of the way Swamiji felt to create Ananda after a great deal of meditation and study, is the model is cooperation. We go so far as to speak of cooperative obedience, because it is a monastic order, but not obedience that is entirely determined by the superior. It's not superior in the monastic sense, which is the one who has a higher position than you. But cooperative obedience means that everybody works together to try to make things come out in the right way. And because we're dealing with couples who have karma with each other, and then you bring children into it, you have these very complicated karmic situations. You don't just have a single monk or a single nun who is in complete control of their own destiny without those corresponding responsibilities. You just have a lot of issues that you have to really try to understand. And the model that Swami wanted was the financial system of Ananda, as Swami said it, is just the one that everyone is used to. People work for money. They get salaries for what they do. They have whatever money they have belongs to them, and they can make whatever decisions they feel to make. It's not like everything belongs to the monastery. In the very traditional Kali Yuga monasteries, we would talk about our cup. Even though it's the one that I'm using, we would still call it our cup and our fork and our plate in order to break down that personal. But when you have families, and you have families with children, and again, marriage relationships, there's an element of individuality in there. And it's an interesting question. And what Ananda's been trying to do over these 50 years in our communities, and by extension as the Ananda way of life, is what is the balance between the community, between discipleship. And as it happens, our masters are not in the physical body at this time. And even Swamiji, who was our living link, has also been off the planet now for 8 or 9 years. But we still have people within the community who may have more experience than others and who have responsibility. And in earlier sections, we were just sort of talking a little bit about how that all works together, and we'll have more of it before we're finished. But then it becomes this balance between individual self-determination and cooperation with the whole flow of energy. So this whole section they were on, which is home life, how much of my home is my home, and how much of my home is also, to a certain extent, the business of the community. And this goes back to a couple of sections ago when Swami says, life in a community cannot also include too strong a declaration of individual independence. If one has the need for that kind of individual independence, community is probably not the best way to live. A very serious and good friend of mine, who was part of Ananda in the 70s, has remained lifelong very, very dedicated to the spiritual path, but he found community life unbearable, is the only way I can put it. Not because it was unbearable, but for him it was unbearable. He just absolutely needed his complete independence. And it's interesting, I had forgotten, he told me himself, that Swami had suggested he buy land nearby because then he could have the benefit of community life and the benefit of complete independence. Swami just saw his temperament. It wasn't a judgment, it was just an observation. So now we're talking literally about the homes in which people live. And one of the reasons Swami wanted people to have financial independence and, financial responsibility for themselves is because he's seen too often in monasteries that a person will lose their vocation. That's a phrase that's common in the Catholic context. Your vocation is your call to live the monastic life. They'll lose their vocation, but they'll be entirely dependent on the monastic community. So they really don't want to be there anymore, but if they came in as a young person, or they have no concept of how to make their own way in the world, so they stay in the monastery not because it's expansive for them, but because they're afraid to leave. Of course, it doesn't do anything good for the monastic community, nor does it, as a rule, do much good for the person. Yes, of course, sometimes you should stick it through, but stick with it even still. But Swami said lifelong dedication to something that has ceased to be dynamic for you is not necessarily a spiritual victory. So he wanted to give sufficient individual independence to people so that their choice would always be, they would always be free to make a dynamic choice. So, but still, when we talk about home life, the individual resident should not think of their home as their castle, but as an extension of community life, and in this case, he says, as a temple of God. So I'm just sort of reflecting on how all of those pieces work together. So now, and I'm also explaining why the rules say every home ought to have a separate room or some area set apart and preferably screened off in a larger room as the family's private meditation chapel. This room or separately defined area should contain an altar on which are centrally displayed the photographs of the Ananda line of gurus. Other pictures and images may be displayed as well, according to the members' individual devotional preferences. Centrally placed on every altar, however, should be pictures of the Ananda gurus. It's a very specific piece of information, and much of this book is not nearly as specific as that. So we come again to this issue that I've used several times. It's not so much that you have to do this, is that if Ananda is your spiritual choice, then this is what you would want to do. And he starts by saying, every resident of an Ananda community, everyone who strives to live according to the Ananda way of life, should recognize the importance of having within the home a dedicated area, because presumably we are going to be following the spiritual practices which include daily meditation. And we talked about that. The section on spiritual practices comes earlier in this book than the section on home life. So if we're going to follow those spiritual practices, Swami is just explaining that this is what it looks like. What it looks like is I have a certain amount of space in my home, and what I need to do is I need to dedicate a portion of it, if possible, an entire room. I've lived more or less in the same place now for many years, but in the first 10 or 15 years of my spiritual life, I shifted around a little bit more. But wherever I would live, I would always start with, where is the altar? Just like the first thing to be determined in the house is, where is the altar going to be? And then everything else will settle itself afterwards. You can see behind me, it's somewhat the picture of the altar. This is the living room of the house in which I've lived for, let's say, almost not quite 15 years now. This particular house, which is quite spacious, it has 3 bedrooms, and it is the community house within the community that I live in. It's not, even though I have a room in this house, it's not like the whole house belongs to me. I really am the steward of the house, because this is where, in normal times, we have many community meetings and we have parties and social gatherings, and it's the guest house, essentially, for the community and so on. So it was very important from when we first moved into it, where is the altar? Where in the living room of this house is the altar going to be? And what you see behind the yellow wall, it's actually a fireplace. And for a long time, a long time meaning when I first moved in, I had a few friends coming over. We kept trying to preserve the fireplace and also put an altar in this living room. And it just finally became obvious that it was just impossible, that the fireplace had to go. And in this particular climate, you only get to use the fireplace very, very little. But the living room required an altar. The only real place for the altar was where the fireplace had been, so we just boarded up the fireplace. And it was no real sacrifice to do that, but I'm describing the process. First priority. Where am I going to bring the masters into this? And then Swami says, we want our line of gurus prominently displayed. And other images, if you like. I always, in every altar I've ever had, I have a very prominent picture of Swami Kriyananda. And that falls into the individual preferences. Because for me, it's my link to the masters is Swami Kriyananda, and my gratitude to him requires that I have a clear, dynamic image of him somewhere. The way this altar is set up now, for the sake of the camera, Swami's picture is small. Before we started filming in this way, a very large picture of him was quite prominent on that wall. Now it's just slightly out of camera range, but it's still in the room and still in the same way. But what we're doing is installing the masters is a way to say it. In India, they have some wonderful traditions about this because they've been doing it for so long, where you bring the images to life. And prior to the time that you do the Vedic ceremonies that turn the image from just being clay and paint into the actual deity. And once you have awakened the deity, after that you can't treat it like an inanimate object. you have to treat it like the living deity, because that's what it is at that point. Now, I'm not quite so traditional in the way that I do it, but once these images have been on the altar for a time, they change. And what you have done is you now have the living presence of the Master in your house. And when I've visited in India and been a guest in Indian homes, it's there's always a puja room, um, where the daily ceremonies are carried out. It's just fundamental. The houses are built with a puja room. Puja means worship ceremony. They're just built with a puja room. You have to have one. Every apartment, you just have to have one. And it's really considered to be the room where the deities live. And you treat it accordingly. And they're your special guests. And you feed them and you take care of them just as you would any other guest in the home. When we took over the church that is now the Ananda Palo Alto Church, it was St. Aloysius Catholic Church. It was built in the late 40s or in the 50s. Very prominent church on a main street in this area. It became Ananda's Church in 1994, so it's been quite a while since we've had it. A great gift from God to have this beautiful church building. And prior to that time, we had a storefront, a retail space that we were renting about 4 blocks away. And the Sunday that we let go of the lease on the retail space and took over the church building, we did a procession after Sunday service. It was also practical because it was a way to move things, but we had maybe 50 people, and we took every spiritual image, every picture of the gurus and every little statue from everywhere in the building, and everybody picked up something. And we walked chanting. We did a procession. And I'm quite uninhibited about these things, but some people are quite more inhibited. And I remember standing in front of the congregation, telling them what we were about to do. I don't think I gave them much notice. And some of them jumped in with good spirit, and some of them managed to slip out a little early. So they didn't have to parade down the streets of Palo Alto, but it was totally fun. We paraded down the street. We came in the front door of the church. We carried all of the spiritual images, and we just set them all on the altar. And then we sat down and we chanted for a time, and it changed. We just completely changed the building because we'd brought the masters in and laid them there. Then there was another point when we were actually setting up the more formal big altar, and there was myself. I believe there were 2 other women with us. Then we must have had some men with us too, because there was some heavy work involved, now that I think about it. We had some kind of a lift or a big ladder, and we couldn't have managed that on our own. And we put up a sort of informal altar at that point, just a curtain, but we hung big pictures of the gurus, put the 5 gurus up on this altar thing, and we were doing it late at night. So by the time we finished, it was past midnight. And the building is fairly large. It holds about 300 people, shoulder to shoulder. That's the maximum. And we'd put it all up, and I'd been really close to it, hanging them and like this. And I turned my back and I walked to the front door, basically. And then I turned around and I looked for the first time at what was now our temple with the masters there. And I don't think this was my imagination. I think the word is astral wind, which is like you feel a wind, but it's not a physical wind. I felt this astral wind come off of the altar, and I felt all the masters just in that power, and they went right over my head and out the front door. And it was just really like, now we can get to work, was the powerful feeling that I had. And I mean, I can still conjure that experience just right to my mind, because we had set up the altar. So what I'm really saying with this is not just sentimental, that wherever you live, and depending on your circumstances. When a friend of mine who is devoted to the spiritual path, but has a family life that doesn't support dedicating any room in the house to it, has created a sort of a little box. And when she opens the lid, she has this beautiful little altar set up, and then she just can put the lid down. She's not hiding her dedication, but there's just nowhere in the family where she can set it up. But she has it. And she opens it up, and then there she's created her altar. So don't let circumstances deter you. It's not a question of whether it's gold plated or not. I mean, you can make the whole thing out of poster board if you want to. It's a question of how sincerely and deeply you make the relationship with the masters and how much you put them at the center of your life experience. And I don't feel that this is a small thing. Now I'm a bhakti and I'm devotional and I'm liturgical and I like ceremony and I like ritual and I like celebration. It's just one of the things that I really enjoy. I mean, I read a book actually was by a very Orthodox Christian about churches. This was years ago when we were just starting and I was trying to figure out how to do this. And he talked about, different clergy have different strengths. And in reading that, I thought, I like ceremony, I like liturgy. This is one of the things I like. Other people are much more impersonal. But don't become so impersonal that you lose the potential of focused devotion, where you can just constantly go and make that connection, because places assume the vibration of what happens there. And if there is a place, no matter how small, right now I mentioned that I have one room in this house. So I have one room in this house that's really mine. And in my own room, I talked about the altar that's in the living room here. But in my own room, I have a seat that's, the square footage, the footprint of it is essentially the same size as me when I'm sitting on my kneeling bench. And my altar there is small like this, but it's a little corner of the room. And I never eat breakfast in that room, and I don't sit there and read novels or anything. It's just a few square feet. But it's sufficient. When I step onto that mat, I'm looking at the masters. And the only thing that happens there is that conversation. And when I need to talk to them, that's where I go and sit. When I mean, this is an extreme example of this, but it's beautiful in that the home where I wasn't, not mine, that was introduction to what I'm about to say. Here is another example. The home in Calcutta where Master grew up, 4 Garpar Road. In Autobiography of a Yogi, he mentions it. And the Ghosh family, which is Master's, biological family, the Ghosh family still has possession of that house, and subsequent generations. Now we're dealing with Hari Krishna was the son of Master's brother. Hari Krishna was Master's nephew. So Hari Krishna's son and daughter-in-law and Hari Krishna's granddaughter, I mean, they still live in 4 Garpar Road, and they still are responsible for that house. And there is this small attic room, which was the puja room of the house. Small attic room of the house where Master meditated, his attic meditation room, he called it. An entire floor has now been built around what used to be on the roof, is now literally in the middle of the house. But it's a small room, like as big as a big walk-in closet, but it's not a closet because there's a window. But this has been the sacred room of that house since Master was a child, which is more than like 100 years, more than 100 years. This room has always been the sacred room in the house. And for the residents of the house, this is what I was going to say that's so touching. It's like Master lives there. That's Master's room in the house. Just as if he were still living in the house, that's his bedroom. And when the residents of the house have anything particular to ask him, they'll go to his room and speak to him. And it's just when the sacred space in the house is just there as part of the house. It's not like we never step into it, except when we're about to sit down and do our Kriya. It's actually just the opposite. It's just the room where they live. So whenever you want to talk to them particularly, you go into their room and you can have a little conversation there. And it becomes like that. It's not that they're not everywhere in the house, but it helps you to realize that this is where everything in the house really emanates from this point. And this is where I can always go for comfort. And it will become so. It's not sentiment. See, what we're doing with by installing the masters and enlivening the images like this, sometimes when we use our creative imagination or our visualization or so on, and there's certain kinds of teaching, and this is, and there's a value to this. It's not central to what we teach, but it's not a wrong teaching. Where you use your powers of visualization and imagination to transport yourself into a world that you want to be part of. And this is where, you would lie on your back and somebody would guide you and you would think about a beautiful place and there's a waterfall and there's a stream running through it and there's prisms, that the sunlight on the water is creating rainbows and, and as I go along, I see the fairies dancing and here comes a white unicorn with a rainbow colored horn and, and I climb on the back of the unicorn and we sail across. I mean, all of these are wonderful. You can see I can do this sort of thing effortlessly. And you can change your vibration and uplift your vibration. But it's imagination that you're using. The unicorn with the rainbow horn and my ability to climb on his back. It's not, well, you could say, because I can imagine it exists somewhere, but you understand what I'm saying. But when we make an altar and put the images of the master there and call it Master's room and feel that he's always there, that Babaji is always in that room just waiting for me to come and talk to him. We are using the power of imagination to transport us to something that is actually there. So what we're doing is we are using the power of imagination to find a vibration where the ever-existent vibration will meet our projection. I think that's the total difference between what I'm talking about and the unicorn, is that the masters are in that room. And I was thinking about this recently. Everybody who has a near-death experience, and there's countless examples of this, talk about the fact that the astral world, where we continue to exist when we exit our physical body, we have this mental image that it's far away. But they all say that it's right here, that it's just right here. It's just existing on a different vibratory level. So what we're helping ourselves to understand by creating a focal point is we're just giving ourselves a method to break the delusion and enter into the reality of it. So make a place for the masters to live in your home because they want to live with us. It's just that our attention is scattered. And what we have to do is we have to concentrate hard enough to be able to penetrate through this illusion. Now that's all we're doing. We're just pushing aside the curtain so that we can be in that reality. And so a fundamental principle of the Ananda way of life is that we make a room in our home, or at least as Swami says, a piece of a room. We make a place in our home and we give that space to the masters so that that we will be able to find them. They are always the same. It's our attention that shifts. So we create for ourselves a way to keep our attention focused. God bless you, my friends.